Recently, the Canon EOS R8 was released, and I do not have that camera, but I haven't made a video about its announcement because it's kind of in a weird position. I feel like Canon is trying to compete with itself with this camera because of the R7, which is at the exact same price point. So today we're going to be discussing the differences between the Canon R7 and the Canon R8. So let's get into it. So first off, the main difference, and the one that everybody is talking about, is that Canon EOS R8 is a full-frame camera, unlike this R7, which is not. This is a crop sensor camera. I believe it has a crop factor of 1.6 times, so a much smaller sensor compared to the R8. Now, there is a downside with that though. The Canon R8 does not have image stabilization like this R7, so you're losing a larger sensor for image stabilization and vice versa. Also, the Canon R7 has a full mechanical shutter, unlike the Canon's R8 first curtain electronic shutter, so that is a benefit to the R7. The R7 can also do 15 frames a second with mechanical shutter, and the Canon R8 can only do 6 frames a second with first curtain electronic shutter. Now, this is mainly to fix the problem with rolling shutter, where sometimes when you're panning or something is moving fast, the image can become slanted. Now, the Canon R8 addresses this by having the new sensor that's in the Canon R6, which almost completely fixes the issue. Now, this is not pure global shutter, so there will be some problems with very fast moving objects, but it is better, and it can do electronic shutter up to 40 frames a second versus the 30 frames a second on the R7, but the R8 does reduce the quality to 12 bits instead of 14 bits at that speed. So overall, some great speed there, but you will lose a little bit of quality at those speeds. Now, beyond the main sensor differences of these two cameras, the other main differences are the SD card slots. This camera, the Canon R7, has two UHS 2 card slots. So for example, I can have 2 cards in here. I've only got one right now, this one from Angelbird, it's great. But I can have either record one to the next, or both of them at the same time, or one for photo and one for video. And I found that to be really helpful. And the Canon EOS R8 only has one UHS 2 card slot. So you cannot have redundant recording or all those other features that I just mentioned. And the third main difference between these two cameras is the battery. The Canon R7 uses these LPE6 batteries, which are a great capacity and last for many hours, while the Canon R8 uses LPE17 batteries, which are much smaller and do not last nearly as long. So if you get the R8, make sure to get more batteries. One of the main reasons I got the Canon R7 is because I already had a ton of these LPE6 batteries, and that is quite an expense to have to rebuy all of those in a different size. And then the last main difference that I can see being an issue is the Canon EOS R7 has a bigger EVF than the R8, so that's something to consider. But overall, they're both great cameras. So now let's talk about what the differences would mean in the real world. As far as the sensor goes, that is the most important, because the larger sensor, well, it will allow a lot more light in. So, for example, when shooting in dark environments, a full-frame sensor is a huge advantage. Also, when wanting to go super wide with lenses, a full-frame sensor will allow you to use full-frame glass, which does not have a crop factor, so it results in a much wider image. But that can also be a problem if you're trying to zoom in a lot. So crop sensor lenses are better if you're wanting to zoom in a ton and have a huge reach. So I would say where this comes into the most difference is if you're a vlogger versus a bird photographer. If you're a bird photographer, you probably will want to get the R7 because of that. But if you are a vlogger, I would highly recommend getting the R8 because of that field of view. It will make a huge difference on your lenses and will really matter a lot. But a downside for the vloggers is, well, the R8 does not have image stabilization like the R7 does. So that could be an advantage for the R7. But there are some issues where, with the R7's image stabilization, it does wobble a little bit on super wide lenses, so that could be an issue too. So here are my final recommendations for as far as the sensors go and the applications. If you're shooting in dark environments, I would recommend getting the R8, if that's your primary usage of this camera. If you're shooting with big lenses and wanting to get a ton of reach, I would recommend the R7, because it has that crop sensor lens and will give you more reach that way. Also, the R7 does have more megapixels than the R8, so you can zoom in a little bit more digitally. But the pixels are smaller, so they won't allow in as much light. But that's fine if you're in the daytime. Now, as far as the Canon R8 goes, again, dark environments, it's probably going to completely beat the R7 in that. But I'd also recommend it for vloggers. Because of that super big sensor with a wide-angle lens, it'll be the best results. but you will probably have to, well, not probably have to, I would highly recommend getting a lens with image stabilization. So for example, this Sigma 18-35 f1.8 I have here does not have any stabilization, so I would not recommend getting a lens like this with the R8, but it's fine with the R7 because it has the built-in stabilization. Ideally, you would have built-in stabilization on the camera and the lens for the best results, but if you go with the R8, you simply just don't have that. Canon makes some great lenses from the 16-35mm and I think the 15-24, something like that, that have built-in image stabilization and the native RF mount that will work great with the Canon R8 or the R7. Now, as far as the mechanical shutter goes, it is a big deal to have that versus the first curtain electronic. I believe the first curtain electronic should be able to fix all of the rolling shutter, but it's just nice to have a full mechanical shutter with the camera. So I would say if you're doing a lot of fast moving things, to get the Canon R7 because of that mechanical shutter. If you want to get the bigger sensor of the R8, there is the Canon EOS R6 Mark II or the Canon R5, which have full frame sensors and the mechanical shutter. There's also the Canon R3 with global shutter that completely fixes the issue, but that's quite expensive at around $6,000, and in a completely different market than these two cameras. Other than the differences I just mentioned, the cameras are very similar in their feature sets and all record in the same resolutions and the same codecs. There is one small difference, and that is that the Canon R7 is not going to overheat and the Canon R8 might at 4K at 60 frames a second. Also, I forgot to mention this earlier, the Canon R8 has a 24 megapixel sensor versus the 35 megapixels of the Canon R7. So overall, I'd say that both cameras are great in their offerings, but having the same price point is kind of confusing. So either camera will work pretty well, but depending on your situation, one camera might be better for you than the other. So that's pretty much it for this video. If you want to learn more about the Canon EOS R7, I've made several videos on the topic, one of which is linked up right here. And here is a quick montage shot on this camera to give you some perspective on how good it is. Well, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, that would help me out a lot. If you have any questions about this lens or any of the other equipment I use, please leave it in the comments below and I will answer your question. Also, if you enjoyed this video and would like to support me, there is a link down below to my Patreon page, so you can support me that way if you want. Well, that's it for this video, and thank you for watching.